The easiest way to underestimate a black student is to assume confidence must be borrowed if it comes without permission. Malik Turner had seen that look before. Not just at debate tournaments. In classrooms. In honors seminars. In scholarship interviews. Anywhere adults like to call young people promising while quietly sorting them into categories they would later pretend not to have made. Some students walked into a room and were treated like future authority. Others had to perform brilliance twice before anyone called it by its name. So when the opposing coach smirked during pairings and told one of the judges, just loudly enough to travel, "My kid should be fine if this stays on substance," Malik did not react. He just adjusted his tie, opened his case binder, and waited for the rules to do what they were designed to do. Because the wrong people love talent right up until it stops being manageable. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, exposure, and moments when public certainty collapses under its own arrogance, subscribe and stay with me. The state invitational finals were held in the old county courthouse downtown, the kind of building people preserved because power looked good in stone. Tall columns. Echoing marble hallways. Wood-paneled hearing rooms converted for student competition. Brass placards polished for the occasion. Volunteers in school badges hustling between rounds like democracy depended on lanyards and clipboards. The tournament was serious enough that everybody there understood what a final meant. Scholarship visibility. College notice. Reputation. And for a school like East Ridge Public Magnet, where resources were respectable but not wealthy and prestige was usually imported from somewhere wider, a title meant more than a trophy. Malik Turner was 17 and the best debater East Ridge had sent in a decade. He was not flashy. That confused people. He did not pace dramatically before rounds or quote philosophers in the hallway for sport. He did not perform intelligence like it needed neon around it. He was slim, composed, and very still when nervous, which made some people mistake him for quiet and others mistake him for easy. Both mistakes usually ended the same way. He took them apart politely. His event was varsity policy debate, where rounds were won on structure, evidence, burdens, timing, and the ability to hear a weak argument while everybody else was still admiring its confidence. Malik loved policy because it rewarded the exact thing the world kept trying to tell him was too much when it came from him: precision. His partner, Lila Chen, had carried them through prelims and quarterfinals with sharp cross-examinations and ruthless line-by-line refutation. But she had gotten sick after semis and could barely stand by lunch. Under tournament rules, East Ridge was allowed to continue if a single debater could carry the final as a modified one-person side against a full team, so long as the panel agreed. Most people considered that a courtesy path to a respectable loss. Malik considered it a chance. The final pairing put East Ridge against St. Bartholomew Academy, a private school with old plaques, older money, and the kind of debate culture that teaches teenagers to sound like federal clerks before they're old enough to rent a car. Their lead speaker was Connor Whitmore. White. Tall. Expensive haircut. Perfect posture. The kind of student adults call formidable before he opens his mouth because he already looks like the son of the outcome they expected. Connor was good. That part was true. So was the rest of it. He had a coach who treated wins like inheritance, parents who funded summer institutes, and a school culture that taught students to confuse polish with superiority. St. Bart's had won the state invitational 3 of the last 5 years and behaved like losing to public school kids would qualify as weather damage. Their coach, Russell Dean, wore a navy blazer with the St. Bart's crest and the expression of a man who had built too much of his identity around talented white boys speaking quickly in ordered rooms. He had watched Malik all day with the particular smile some men reserve for black excellence they hope will become overconfidence if left unattended. During semis, when Malik had dismantled a suburban powerhouse team on energy regulation, Russell Dean had shaken his head and said to another coach, "Sharp kid. A little theatrical, but sharp." Malik heard that. Theatrical. Because he used voice. Because he was alive in the round. Because white boys calling arguments structurally incoherent and monotone sounded disciplined, while Malik making the same point with force became style. Now, outside hearing room B before the final, Russell Dean looked at Lila Pale on a bench, then at Malik alone with the East Ridge file box, and smiled as if the universe had finally corrected an administrative inconvenience. "My kid should be fine if this stays on substance," he said to one of the parent volunteers standing near the ballot table. He said it casually. That was the point. Cruel people who want deniability always say the ugliest things like weather reports. Malik kept his eyes on the case binder. Lila muttered, "Please destroy him." He almost smiled. Inside the room, the final panel sat at the front. 3 judges. A retired appellate attorney. A political science professor. And presiding over the panel, Judge Helen Morris, a black woman in her 60s, retired from the State Court of Appeals, invited every year because she believed debate should still have something to do with rules instead of merely speed and posture. That mattered. Malik noticed it. Not because he expected favor. Because he respected rooms where standards had actually survived power. The resolution was a nasty one: federal authorities should require algorithmic transparency in public sector decision systems. Dense enough for technical traps, philosophical enough for style points, and perfect for St. Bart's because Connor loved sounding inevitable about institutional design. The modified format gave East Ridge shortened prep and speech adjustment allowances. St. Bart's accepted with fake graciousness. Connor opened fast. Too fast, maybe, though people who look like him are rarely called frantic when they speak in legal machine gun bursts. He framed the case as an administrative stability issue, argued transparency mandates would cripple implementation, overload agencies, and create litigation exposure that hurt exactly the communities reformers claimed to protect. He cited 3 studies in the first 3 minutes, 2 law review notes, 1 task force memo, and enough diction to make ordinary people in the room feel briefly less educated for blinking. It was good. Very good. And exactly the kind of case that makes weak opponents panic because it sounds expensive. Malik did not panic. He took notes. Flow sheet. Tagline. Burden shift. Missed comparative weighing. An ugly little contradiction in Connor's second contention where implementation risks somehow outweighed democratic legitimacy until judicial review was mentioned, at which point review suddenly became a cure rather than a burden. There it was. The seam. When Malik stood for his first speech, the room seemed to recalibrate around him. That always happened. People think underestimation is passive. It isn't. It's active anticipation of disappointment. And when the underestimated person stands to answer, the room often leans in not because it believes, but because it's waiting to see where the overreach begins. Malik put one hand lightly on the lectern and began. No theatrics. No grand opening. Just structure. Judge, the negative wants you to fear scrutiny more than opacity. That only works if you ignore who opaque systems already harm. Then he started cutting. Not wildly. Not emotionally. Precisely. He isolated Connor's burden claims and showed where St. Bart's relied on procedural overload without proving why public systems should remain exempt from intelligible accountability. He split administrative inconvenience from democratic injury. He turned their litigation argument against them by pointing out that systems too weak to survive explanation were already too dangerous to govern people. Then he walked through case law and comparative standards with the kind of clarity that makes brilliance look less like spectacle and more like inevitability. Lila, watching from the side table under a blanket and 2 layers of fever, gave one tiny vicious nod. By cross-examination, Connor had stopped smiling. That mattered too. Because boys like Connor usually expect black students to be best when reacting, not when controlling pace. Malik was doing something worse than surviving. He was setting the terms. Connor tried to recover and rebuttal with speed and patronizing calm. At the end of the day, he said, looking toward the panel with that easy entitlement prep school student's mistake for neutrality, my opponent is making a moral appeal where the rule set requires a policy analysis. Malik wrote that sentence down. Good. Very good. Because what Connor meant was not about rules. What he meant was that Malik's argument sounded too alive, too grounded in actual human consequence, too unwilling to become abstract enough for St. Bart's comfort. And then Connor made the mistake that lost him the round. He started freelancing. Maybe he felt pressure. Maybe Russell Dean's expression in the back row had gotten a little too tense. Maybe losing to one black public school debater in a courthouse room full of scholarship scouts had begun to feel impossible in the insulting sense of the word. Whatever the reason, Connor moved away from the written framework both teams had agreed to and introduced a new standards claim in the final rebuttal. That modified single debater round should not receive full procedural accommodation once substantive argument had begun. In other words, he wanted the judge to penalize Malik for using the very adjusted format the tournament had already approved. A few people in the room shifted. The political science professor frowned. Judge Morris looked down at the rules packet in front of her. Malik's pen stopped. There it was. Not just arrogance. Panic wearing arrogance's clothes. Russell Dean, in the back row, actually looked relieved for half a second, which told Malik everything. This had either been coached or was at least the sort of move Dean would rather defend than lose without. When Malik rose for final rebuttal, he did not rush. He closed his folder. Looked once at Connor. Then at the panel. And he said, "Judge, before I answer substance, I need to answer what just happened to the round." The room went still. Good. Because rules matter most when power tries to revise them midstream. Malik picked up the printed tournament guidelines from the table. The negative has just asked you to ignore the approved accommodation structure for a one-person final after accepting that structure before the round began. Connor shifted in his chair. Russell Dean's face hardened. Malik continued. That is not argument. That is an attempt to change the standard because the round stopped going where they expected. There are sentences that land because they are loud. And there are sentences that land because every person in the room knows you just described exactly what they watched happen. This was the second kind. Connor tried to interrupt. Judge Morris lifted one hand and he stopped. Malik opened the rule packet. Not performatively. Methodically. Then he read. Section 9, Tournament Modifications. In the event of approved single debater substitution due to medical inability of a listed partner, the remaining competitor retains full accommodation status for speech structure, prep adjustment, and burden equivalency once round acceptance is confirmed by both sides in panel. He looked up. Both sides confirmed. The panel confirmed. The round began under those rules. The negative cannot decide in final rebuttal that rules only count when they help them. Connor's ears had gone red. Malik wasn't done. He held up the packet again and said, and because my opponent said this room requires policy analysis, let's do policy analysis. Rules that can be rewritten by the side currently losing are not rules. They are preference pretending to be procedure. Lila closed her eyes briefly, either from fever or satisfaction. The appellate attorney on the panel actually leaned back, almost smiling. The political science professor stopped writing and simply listened. And Judge Helen Morris, calm as stone, said the line that ended whatever remained of St. Bart's plan. Mr. Turner, please hand me the rule packet. He did. She read the section herself. Then another. Then one more clause farther down. The room waited. Russell Dean, for the first time that day, looked unsure of the air around him. Judge Morris looked up over her glasses and said, very clearly, the rules are not ambiguous. No one moved. She turned to Connor. Counsel for the negative will not argue against the approved format after affirming it at the start of the round. Connor opened his mouth. Closed it. Then Judge Morris did something even cleaner. She read the rule aloud to the room. Not because she needed to understand it. Because the room did. Every line. Every allowance. Every confirmation requirement. By the time she finished, there was nowhere left for Russell Dean's substance comment to hide, nowhere left for Connor's procedural pivot to sound strategic instead of desperate, and nowhere left for anybody in hearing room B to pretend that Malik had not just won the most important point in the round before he even returned to substance. Then he returned to substance. And he was merciless. Not emotional. Not wild. Merciless. He extended his transparency framework. Collapsed their administrative burden weighing. Showed where Connor had dropped comparative standards. Explained why accountable public systems cannot claim legitimacy from opacity just because explanation costs money. And then, in the final minute, he tied it all together with a sentence the room would repeat afterward in hallways, cars, and text threads for the next week. The negative wants you to trust institutions more than people harmed by them, and trust their interpretation of the rules more than the rules themselves. That is the same argument twice. Then he sat down. The silence after was the kind that only follows full public reversal. Connor gave his closing statement, but it sounded different now. Smaller. Not because he had become less smart. Because the room no longer believed his confidence was neutral. When the judges left to deliberate, nobody spoke right away. Then the appellate attorney on the panel stopped near Malik's table, looked at the rule packet, looked at him, and said, "Good catch." That meant more than applause would have. Russell Dean did not look at Malik on the way out. Of course he didn't. Because men like him always prefer to pretend the wall they just hit came from nowhere. The decision took 12 minutes. Longest 12 minutes of Lila's life. Maybe Malik's too, though he would never have admitted it. When the judges returned, the whole hearing room rose and sat again. Judge Morris held the ballot envelope. Her face gave nothing away. Then, on a 2-1 decision, the state invitational championship goes to East Ridge Public Magnet. Lila screamed once. Actually screamed. Then coughed so hard she had to sit down. Malik did not move for 1 second. Not because he was stunned. Because the wind landed where all the other things had landed first, inside the long memory of every room where he had been expected to impress, but not to control. Then he stood. People clapped. Some loudly. Some with the careful force of adults realizing they had just watched a correction bigger than a student round. The appellate attorney judge nodded at him once as he passed. The political science professor asked for his paper after the ceremony. Even a few St. Bart's parents clapped with the brittle decency of people who knew their children had just been beaten fair and thoroughly. Russell Dean did not clap. Good. Because not every witness deserves the comfort of easy recovery. Later, when the trophy photos were done and the courthouse halls had begun emptying into evening, Judge Morris found Malik and Lila near the front steps. Lila was wrapped in a school blanket and still looked like victory might kill her before the flu did. Judge Morris said, "Mr. Turner." "Yes, ma'am." "You won on more than substance in there." Malik nodded slightly. "I know." She studied him for a moment and then said the sentence that stayed with him longest. "They expected your argument to need permission before it became authority." He looked at her, surprised not by the truth of it but by hearing it named so plainly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Her expression softened, just a little. "Never wait for that permission." Then she walked away. That night, videos from the final started circulating online. Not the whole round. Just clips. Connor trying to pivot the rules. Malik opening the packet. Judge Morris reading the section aloud. The final line about institutions wanting trust twice. By Monday morning, college coaches had emailed. A summer institute director reached out. A Civil Liberties Foundation sent an invitation to apply for a youth policy fellowship. Russell Dean, meanwhile, sent a bland statement to the tournament committee about competitive clarification concerns, which read exactly like something written by a man trying to turn humiliation into process notes. It didn't work. Because the version most people would tell was simple. Nobody expected the black student to win the case. Then the judge read the rules aloud. He won. But the truer version was this: a black student walked into a final already being measured against expectations he did not create. A white coach and a white opponent decided substance sounded different when it came from him and tried to move the standards mid-round once his brilliance became inconvenient. And then the rules were read aloud in the very room where they hoped confidence would be enough to carry them, and the same system they tried to bend closed around them instead. That is what prejudice often looks like in academic competition. Not always open insult. Sometimes just lower assumptions. A quicker attempt to redefine the terms. A quiet belief that a black student's argument needs extra permission before it counts as authority. Until the rules are read aloud. And then suddenly the room has to confront what was really on trial the whole time. Not whether he understood the case. Whether they were ready to admit he had mastered it before they ever gave him credit for belonging there. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe, and stay close. There are more stories like this one waiting.